Scary telling.
I had just moved into a new apartment and was still getting used to the sounds and quirks of the place. But when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of knocking on glass, I knew something was wrong. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I got out of bed and walked over to the window, but there was no one there. The knocking was coming from the other side of the room. That's why I noticed it. The knocking was coming from the mirror. I walked over to the mirror and put my ear up to it. The knocking was definitely coming from the other side. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was so unnerving that I couldn't sleep. The next night, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder and more persistent than before. I was starting to get scared. Who or what could be knocking on the other side of the mirror? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just a loose nail or something. But I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that was starting to creep up inside me. The next day, I decided to do some research on the history of the apartment. I found out that the building used to be a hospital and that some patients had died there under mysterious circumstances. Some even speculated that the hospital was haunted by the spirits of the dead. That's when I remembered something else. The mirror in my room was an antique, brought over from Europe by the previous owner. I had never given it much thought, but now I was starting to wonder if there was more to it than just a decorative piece. That night, the knocking started again. But this time, it was accompanied by a faint whisper. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like a plea for help. I was paralyzed with fear, but something inside me urged me to confront whatever was on the other side of the mirror. I mustered up all my courage and asked who was there. To my surprise, I got an answer. "It's me," the voice whispered. "I'm trapped on the other side." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was there really someone or something trapped inside the mirror? And if so, how could I help them? I did some more research and found out that there was a ritual that could be performed to release spirits trapped in mirrors. It involved lighting candles, reciting a chant, and breaking the mirror. I was hesitant at first, but the knocking and whispering continued, and I knew I had to do something. I gathered the supplies I needed and began the ritual. As I lit the candles and recited the chant, I could feel a sense of unease growing inside me. What if I was making a mistake? What if whatever was on the other side of the mirror was evil and would come after me? But it was too late to turn back now. I took a deep breath and swung the hammer at the mirror. The glass shattered into a million pieces, and for a moment, everything was silent. But then, I heard a faint voice thanking me. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. The knocking and whispering had stopped. It was as if the spirit had finally been released. But as I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of something in the broken mirror. A pair of glowing eyes, staring back at me from the other side. I ran out of the room, heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was in that mirror, it was not human. And I knew I had just unleashed something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. For days, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen in the broken mirror was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But the sense of unease never left me. One night, I woke up to find the room shrouded in darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but it wouldn't turn on. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the corner of the room. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I slowly turned towards the source of the sound. And that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure, standing in the corner of the room, tapping its fingers against the wall. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The figure started to move towards me, its shadowy form growing larger and larger as it approached. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the figure loomed over me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, too afraid to move. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the apartment, never looking back. But even now, years later, I can still feel its presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And I know that one day, it will find me again. And there will be no escape from the terror that awaits me in the reflection of that broken mirror. I lost my right hand in a car accident a few months ago. The recovery was tough, but I managed to adapt to my new reality. I learned how to use my left hand for most things and got a prosthetic that allowed me to do some basic tasks. But something strange started happening to me recently that I can't explain. The doctors warned me about phantom limb syndrome, where amputees feel like their missing limb is still there and can even experience sensations or pain in it. I thought I was prepared for it, but I had no idea what was waiting for me. It started a few nights ago when I woke up to a feeling of pressure on my right hand, the one that was no longer there. At first, I thought it was just a muscle spasm or cramp, but the sensation persisted. It felt like someone was holding my hand tightly, and I could even feel the coldness of their fingers against my skin. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only intensified. I was too afraid to turn on the lights and see what was happening, so I just lay there, frozen, until the sensation subsided. The next night, the same thing happened again. This time, I was determined to confront whatever was causing it. I mustered up the courage to turn on the lights, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing at the foot of my bed, dressed in a tattered robe, with long, bony fingers reaching out towards me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, and it was not a friendly one. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. I was paralyzed with fear, and the figure just stood there, watching me, with its cold, lifeless eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly faded away, leaving me alone in my bed, shaking and sweating. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next day I went to see a therapist. I thought I was losing my mind, but the therapist assured me that what I was experiencing was a common side effect of phantom limb syndrome. She said that the brain sometimes creates sensations in the missing limb, and that my fear and anxiety were only making it worse. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Every night, the figure would appear at the foot of my bed, and I could feel its cold fingers on my phantom hand. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting harder and harder to do so. One night, I decided to try and communicate with the figure. I mustered up all my courage and asked it what it wanted. To my surprise, it answered me. "I want my hand back," it whispered in a raspy voice. I needed to cross over to the other side. I was confused and terrified. Who was this figure, and why did it want my hand? Was it a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely? I didn't know, but I knew I had to do something to make it go away. I went to see a medium, hoping she could help me communicate with the figure and understand what was going on. She performed a ritual and contacted the spirit of a man who had died in a car accident at the same spot where I lost my hand. The man's name was John, and he had been searching for his missing hand ever since he died. John's spirit was restless and angry, and he blamed me for taking away his chance to move on. But the medium was able to convince him to let go of his anger and accept his fate. She told him that he would find peace and be able to move on once he let go of his attachment to his missing hand. After the ritual, the figure stopped appearing at the foot of my bed, and I stopped feeling the cold fingers on my phantom hand. It seemed like John had finally found the closure he needed to cross over to the other side. But even now, I can still feel a faint pressure on my phantom hand from time to time. I don't know if it's John or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I've learned to live with it. And every time I do, I'm reminded of the nightmarish experience that taught me that sometimes the dead can be just as real and terrifying as the living. Growing up, my parents always told me not to be afraid of monsters. They said they were real and that I was safe in my room at night. But they were wrong. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a strange noise coming from above me. It sounded like something scratching on the ceiling, but I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was just a mouse or a rat, and that my parents would take care of it in the morning. But the scratching continued, and it started to get louder and more frequent. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to investigate, and that's when I saw her. She was hanging upside down from the ceiling, her long, black hair dangling in front of her face. Her skin was pale and stretched, and her eyes were dark and empty. She looked like a monster, but not the kind my parents warned me about. I was frozen with fear, and I couldn't move or scream. The monster just stared at me, and I could feel her eyes piercing into my soul. She didn't say anything, but I could hear her breathing, slow and labored. I don't know how long we stayed like that, just staring at each other, but eventually, I mustered up the courage to run out of the room and into my parents' bedroom. They didn't believe me at first, but when I insisted, they checked the ceiling and found nothing. The next night, the same thing happened again. I could hear the scratching on the ceiling, and when I looked up, she was there, staring at me with her empty eyes. This time, I was able to move, and I ran out of the room and into my parents' bedroom again. They still didn't believe me, but they agreed to let me sleep in their bed that night. I felt safe and protected, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that the monster was still watching me, waiting for her next move. The nights passed, and the monster continued to haunt me. She never said anything, but her presence was enough to send chills down my spine. I started to become obsessed with her, watching her every move, trying to understand what she wanted. One night, I decided to confront her. I climbed onto my dresser and reached up to touch her, but as soon as my fingers brushed against her skin, she disappeared. I was left alone in my room, feeling confused and scared. I started to research monsters and demons, trying to find out what she could be. I read about creatures that lived in the shadows and fed on fear, and I realized that that was exactly what she was doing to me. She was feeding on my fear, growing stronger every night. I knew I had to do something to stop her. I went to see a psychic, who told me that the monster was a demon summoned by someone who wanted to harm me. She said that I needed to confront my fears and face the demon head-on if I wanted to banish her from my life. That night, I prepared myself for the confrontation. I stood in the middle of my room, closed my eyes, and focused on my breathing. When I opened my eyes again, she was there, staring at me. I stood my ground and refused to be afraid. I shouted at her, telling her that she had no power over me, and that I was not afraid of her anymore. She let out a scream, a deafening, ear-piercing scream, and disappeared into the night. I never saw the monster again, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. I always thought living on the 14th floor of a high-rise apartment would be safe. I mean, Who would bother climbing up 14 flights of stairs just to break into my apartment, right? But now, I realized how wrong I was. It all started a few nights ago when I woke up to a strange noise outside my bedroom window. I brushed it off as just some late-night construction work going on nearby, but the noise continued, growing louder and more persistent. That's when I noticed something. A face was staring back at me from the darkness beyond my window. It was grinning, almost like it was taunting me. I froze, too scared to move or even scream. The face was gone the next morning, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that lingered inside me. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next night, the face returned. This time, it was closer, almost pressed against the glass. It had a strange glow to it, almost like it was made of some otherworldly substance. And the grin was wider, more malevolent than ever before. I wanted to scream, to run out of the room and never look back. But I was paralyzed with fear. Who or what was this thing? How was it possible for it to be staring at me from the 14th floor? I decided to call the building's security, but they didn't believe me. They brushed it off as a prank or a figment of my imagination. They told me to stop wasting their time and hung up. That's when I knew I was on my own. Whatever was outside my window, it was up to me to deal with it. I tried to ignore it, but every night it returned. The grin grew wider and more twisted, almost like it was enjoying my fear. I started to lose sleep, my nerves frayed and my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. One night, I decided enough was enough. I would confront this thing, no matter the cost. I got up, walked over to the window, and opened it. The face was there, grinning back at me like it was waiting for me to make a move. I stared back, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, it spoke. "I've been waiting for you," the voice said. It was distorted, almost like it was coming from a different dimension. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want you," the voice said. "Your fear sustains me. Your terror is like a feast to me." I was horrified. This thing, whatever it was feeding off my fear. And it wanted me to be scared, to be trapped in this cycle of terror forever. But I refused to be a victim. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, focusing all my energy on banishing this thing from my life. When I opened my eyes again, the face was gone. The window was empty, the darkness beyond it unbroken. I thought it was over, that I had finally defeated the grinning visitor. But the next morning, I found a note on my bed. It was written in a language I didn't recognize, but I could feel the malevolent energy emanating from it. And then, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, no one was there. But I could feel a presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. The grinning visitor was still out there, waiting for me. And I knew that this was just the beginning of my nightmare. I never thought much of the night shift. Sure, it was quiet and lonely, but it was also peaceful. I could catch up on paperwork or read a book without any interruptions. But tonight, everything changed. I work security at an old factory building, and my job is to monitor the security cameras and make sure everything is in order. But as I was going about my routine checks, I noticed something strange. There was a face on one of the cameras, staring directly at me. The image was grainy and distorted, but I could make out the eyes and the twisted grin on its lips. I tried to brush it off as just a trick of the light or a glitch in the system, but the face wouldn't go away. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the cellar where the camera was located. As I descended the stairs, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was colder down there than I remembered. When I reached the bottom, I could feel someone or something watching me. The face on the camera was still there, staring at me with its soulless eyes. But as I approached, it disappeared. I thought I was going crazy. Maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise. It was like a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. I followed the sound, my flashlight illuminating the way. That's why I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, watching me. It was tall and slender, with long, spindly arms and legs. Its eyes were dark and empty, and its skin was pale as death. It didn't move, but I could feel its malevolent energy emanating from it. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of this creature. And then, it spoke. "I've been waiting for you," the voice said. It was a whisper, but it echoed through the cellar. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I want you to stay with me," it said. "Forever." I knew then that I was in grave danger. This creature, this watcher in the cellar, wanted to take me away from the world and trap me in its dark realm. I had to escape. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the top, I realized something. The door was locked from the outside. I was trapped. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I had to think fast. I scanned the room for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. That's why I saw it. A small vent in the corner of the room, barely big enough for me to fit through. It was my only chance. I ran towards it, the creature's footsteps echoing in my ears. I could feel its breath on my neck, its hands reaching for me. But I made it. I squeezed through the vent and crawled as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the outside. When I finally emerged, I was covered in dust and dirt. But I was alive. I never went back to that building again. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that whispering voice, calling out to me from the darkness. And I know that the watcher in the cellar is still out there, waiting for its next victim.